history of the United States, okay, really is rooted in the understanding that people came to this country for opportunity, particularly for land. You're going to learn about the indentured servants. You're going to learn about the importance of the promises that were given to these indentures after they worked, a certain number of years, that they would be given typically, a portion of the crop or a portion of land that they could own. And this was very attractive, particularly to men who were not the firstborn sons in their family that would inherit the wealth, but also for people who were desperate to have some level of ownership. And land was really the symbol of ownership and power. Religion plays a very big role in establishing colonies, establishing communities, helping to create sound societies so that people could have families, that society could assist one another when they needed help. A lot of these religious communities were Christian, I would say most of them were, and they were coming here to escape religious persecution, whether it be Catholicism, whether it be Lutheranism, whether it be the Anabaptists that came from Germany, or the Presbyterians in the case of the Scots Irish. So a lot of people were immigrating to the United States for religious freedom, for land opportunity, but also for political inclusion, so to speak, so that once they did own a plot of land, they knew they could now participate in the governing process. And that was something very enticing, particularly for men, to come and accomplish here in the United States. Now, these are not the first riots to be exhibited in the New World. We know that Bacon's Rebellion preceded these riots, certainly, by close to a century. And other riots were taking place in between as well, including slave revolts. People were realizing here in the New World that as populations began to grow, as opportunities began to grow, and also as wars began to emerge, everyone was realizing that we have a part to play in our survival and how we achieve our goals for the future. What does the future look like? Am I going to be a slave for life? Why would I want to be a slave for life? I certainly don't want to be a slave for life, but I'm going to do whatever I can to achieve freedom. And if I can't achieve freedom, then I will do whatever means necessary. And that certainly was the case when you think of, for example, the Stono Rebellion. Now, learning about the Paxton riots, it's easy for we as students of history to assume that these squatters and frontiersmen hated the Indians. They wanted to just abolish them entirely, and they had just so much racism and bigotry towards the Indians. That might be part of the story, but it's not the full story. So, in order to get the full story, we have to understand all the events that led up to this moment in December of 1763. And so, what Mancini does is she explains how how really the overall issue behind the Paxton Boy riots was really fomenting for many, many years. And this had a lot to do with the Quakers. And the Quakers were the dominant elite faction of Pennsylvania. Now, why is that? Because the Quakers had established and created the colony of Pennsylvania, named after William Penn. And William Penn was a Quaker, and he established the Quaker colony of Pennsylvania as a proprietorship. His family became the sole wealthy proprietors of the colony of Pennsylvania. They certainly worked with other proprietors over the years, but over time, some Quakers, many Quakers, and many Scots Irish German frontiersmen were getting more and more frustrated with the Penn family. They believed that they were becoming more corrupt over time, the inheritance of land being passed down through generations, and sort of working with certain political groups to maintain their power and their land was becoming sort of a form of corruption. And so you have people, for example, like Benjamin Franklin, who was advocating by 1764 for the proprietor colony of Pennsylvania to become a royal colony. So can you imagine 1764? This is not that long before the American Revolution. Benjamin Franklin is opting for the Pennsylvania colony to become a royal colony under direct authority by the English crown because he believed the Penn family was abusing their power, and the proprietors that were working with the Penn family and gaining enormous power, many of whom were getting tax exemptions from their land. He believed that to be real corruption, and it was keeping people from gaining land and power. And so, as a result, again, because land is so important, you have these young men, particularly men from the back country of Pennsylvania. They don't live on the East Coast, but these are Scots-Irish. Many of them are Germans. They're growing in number because the Quaker colony is very open to bringing in immigrants of all backgrounds, primarily Scots-Irish and Germans. They were welcoming of these people, allowing them in, but there wasn't enough land for them to live on the eastern seacoast. So many of these people immigrating are going to move into the frontier. They're known as the frontiersmen, okay? These are the men who will tame the wild, right? They will go in, they will build life in the forests, they will build life in the mountains, particularly the regions of Appalachia, and they will establish their communities in those areas. But it's not easy, right? Because as you're going further and further into wilderness, it gets more dangerous. You come into contact with various Indian groups. You're dealing with, hunting, and you're faced with wild animals all the time. So it's not an easy life. It's not like living on the eastern seaboard where there's ships and there's an economy and there's trade and there's mercantilism and there's just so much things happening. Whereas in the backcountry, these immigrants are really the ones paving the land so that they can establish their communities. Now, it's very important to mention that Indians were there. They lived on that land. Many of these Indians were working with the Quakers. They were closely tied in the fur trade with the Quakers. And so, in that sense, we learn that the Quakers were trying to make negotiations, trying to build friendships with certain Indian groups, not all Indian groups, but particularly the Moravian and Conestoga Indians. So, as a result, many of these men in the frontier, whom the historians refer to as the Paxton men, they come together and they get frustrated and they realize if we don't do something to shift the paradigm, to allow us more power, because we're not being represented in our government, the Quakers dominate the government. We don't have the defense that we need against violent Indians. By the way, this is happening during the French and Indian Wars. This whole change of culture within the colonies, where you have Indians and settlers fighting each other, had a lot to do with these wars that were taking place in Europe. As the French and the British are fighting each other in Europe, it is going to transpire here in North America. So you're going to have the French allying with particular Indian groups. Meanwhile, the Quakers and the English are going to ally with other Indian groups, and they're fighting wars against each other using Indians as their political allies. And so what the Scots-Irish realize is they are caught in between these French and Indian wars. They're being massacred by many Indian groups. A lot of it has to do with the fact that they're squatting on Indian lands, and they're seen as a threat because, again, food is scarce. People need food, people need land, people need community, and if they feel threatened, they're going to attack. And that's what happened with the Paxton Boys. They were attacked. The Scots-Irish were attacked by the Indians, and so as a result, because they did not feel defended enough, they did not feel that they were being given proper protection by their government, they decided to take the matters into their own hands. And so the religious component is very interesting because Presbyterians really frowned upon the Quakers because a lot of the Quakers were obviously dominant in the government, but they were also pacifists. Many of them did not believe in going to war with Indians, and many of them wanted to end the wars that were happening with the French and Indian Wars. And they allied with the British government. And so because the Quakers were very closely aligned with the British government, trying to work with the British government, the Paxton Boys and these Scots-Irish frontiersmen really did not feel they were being protected at all. And they believed that they should protect themselves. And so hence begins the process of developing this, what's called the remonstrance, or this list of grievances that kind of goes point by point what the Paxton Boys believe is happening. They say they're not being represented. They're saying that the Quakers make special favored treatment towards the Indians, that they're benefiting on trade and profit versus defending the frontiersmen. That they're not defending the frontiersmen militarily. And so these frontiersmen have to develop their own militias to protect themselves, that they're not being represented properly in government. And so there's just so many things. And again, what I really appreciate about Mancini's article is she goes sort of point by point as to all the different layers that lead up to this momentous moment where the Paxton Boys just go in and kill all these innocent Indians. Bottom line is, if you want to really understand the roots of revolution and the roots of disaffection by Americans, really there is two major reasons why Americans ever in the past opted for revolution. The first was financial, taxation, economics. If your economics are being impressed upon, if people cannot make a livelihood, if they cannot be protected, then that is a reason for revolution, according to the colonists, because we will not be taxed improperly and we will not be taxed if we're not represented. Which leads me to the second reason why colonists typically revolted against their what they would have termed their oppressor government, and that's representation. When your government is not doing what is in the best interest of its citizens, of the people who are willing to live and die for that country or for that region, when the government is not upholding the law, when the government is favoring certain groups over other groups, when the government is changing the law to support certain interests, then the people will eventually get tired of it. Okay. They will try to do the legitimized channels. They will go through those legitimized channels. But over time, if nothing changes, we know the outcome. So again, the Paxton Boys are a perfect example of understanding the roots of why revolution happens and why eventually the American Revolution will happen.